40 million people woke up this morning without reliable access to clean water. Not in a war zone, not in a famine-struck sub-Saharan region that the Western world has learned to file under distant tragedy and move past. In Iran, in a country that sits on some of the most historically significant water systems in the ancient world. In a country whose engineers invented the qanat, one of the most sophisticated underground irrigation systems ever conceived by human civilization, thousands of years before modern hydrology existed as a discipline. In a country whose rivers fed empires, whose agricultural system sustained cities for millennia, whose relationship with water was so central to its civilization that the Persian word for paradise, firdaus, literally means a walled garden fed by flowing water. That water is gone, not running low, not under stress, not facing challenges that competent management and adequate investment might eventually resolve. Gone in the specific, technical, hydrologically documented sense that the underground water tables that took thousands of years of rainfall to accumulate have been pumped beyond their natural recharge rate to the point where recovery, not restoration to previous levels, just recovery to functional minimums, would require decades of perfect management that no institution currently existing in Iran has the capacity, the resources, or the political will to deliver. The point of no return has been crossed, and the 40 million Iranians living inside the crisis zone are not living inside a crisis that will get better. They are living inside a crisis that is getting worse every single day, that is getting worse faster as the compounding effects of financial collapse, infrastructure failure, and climate stress combine into something that water scientists are calling, in the careful, measured language of people who understand that their words will be dismissed as alarmist until the moment they are proven catastrophically correct, an existential water emergency. Let us start with the number that makes every other number make sense. The number is 97. That is the percentage of Iran's surface water sources that are currently classified by the Iranian Ministry of Energy's own internal assessments, the assessments they produce for internal use and do not publish, the assessments that have been obtained and verified by Iranian environmental researchers communicating through diaspora networks, as either critically stressed, functionally depleted, or permanently compromised. Not 97% facing some level of water stress. 97% of Iran's surface water sources, in a condition that Iranian government hydrologists themselves describe, using language that, in scientific terms, means the same thing ordinary language means when it says they are gone. 3%. 3% of Iran's rivers, lakes, wetlands, and surface water systems are currently operating within parameters that could be described as sustainable under any realistic projection of current trends. 3%. In a country of 85 million people spread across a geographic area roughly the size of Alaska, whose agricultural systems, whose industrial base, whose urban water supply networks, whose 40 million people in the crisis zone all depend on surface water sources that are 97% critically stressed or worse. To understand how a country arrives at 97% surface water depletion, you need to understand something about the specific intersection of geography, climate, and governance that has produced this catastrophe. Because this did not happen to Iran, it was done to Iran. By a combination of forces that includes genuine climate stress, Iran's rainfall patterns have declined by approximately 15% over the past 30 years, consistent with regional climate projections, and catastrophically incompetent, systematically corrupt, institutionally captured water management decisions that turned a manageable stress into an existential emergency. The geography of Iran is not forgiving of bad water management. Approximately 65% of Iran's total land area is classified as arid or semi-arid. The country sits in a climate zone where evaporation rates dramatically exceed precipitation rates across most of its territory. The water that does fall, mostly in the northwest, in the Alborz and Zagros mountain ranges that create the orographic effect that concentrates precipitation at altitude, flows through river systems that the country depends on, not because they are abundant, but because they are the only option. There is no backup. There is no alternative supply that good management could unlock. There is the rainfall that falls in the mountains and flows through the rivers to the plains and cities below, and there is everything else, which is desert. In this geographic context, the rainfall decline of 15% is not a manageable stress. It is a crisis that requires immediate, competent, well-funded institutional response to prevent from becoming a catastrophe. What Iran received instead was the Islamic Republic's water management policy across 4 decades, a policy characterized by 3 specific institutional failures that have each contributed to the 97% depletion in ways that compound, rather than add. The first institutional failure was the dam building addiction. The Islamic Republic constructed more dams per capita than almost any country on earth during its existence. Not because the engineering assessments supported dam construction as the optimal water management strategy for Iran's geographic and hydrological context, but because dam construction provided the IRGC's construction conglomerate, Qatam Al Anbiya, with billions of dollars in contracts that built the IRGC's economic empire while producing infrastructure whose political symbolism, the large, visible, officially celebrated monument to revolutionary achievement, served the regime's domestic legitimacy narrative regardless of whether the dam served the actual water management needs of the population it was supposed to benefit. The dams were built. The environmental impact assessments that would have identified the downstream consequences, the destruction of riparian ecosystems, the alteration of seasonal flow patterns, the disruption of the groundwater recharge cycles that the aquifers depend on, the sediment trapping that reduces reservoir capacity and increases evaporation loss, were either not conducted, not published, or not acted upon when they produced findings inconvenient to the construction schedule. The Zayande Rud, the great river of central Iran that fed Isfahan for thousands of years, was dammed so aggressively, its flow so thoroughly diverted and managed and extracted at every point of its journey from the Zagros Mountains to the Central Plateau that it stopped flowing entirely. Not reduced, stopped. A river that sustained one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world ran dry because the institution managing it treated it as an engineering asset to be optimized for short-term extraction, rather than a living system to be sustained for long-term provision. The second institutional failure was the agricultural water policy. Iran's agricultural sector consumes approximately 92% of the country's total water use. This figure is not unusual globally. Agriculture everywhere is the dominant water user. But in Iran's context, it represents a specific policy failure of extraordinary scale. The Islamic Republic subsidized water-intensive agriculture in arid regions as a political tool for maintaining the loyalty of rural constituencies. Farmers in provinces that receive less than 100 millimeters of annual rainfall were provided subsidized water for crops that require 800 to 1,000 millimeters of water per growing season. The water came from aquifers. The aquifers were being drawn down at rates that exceeded their natural recharge rate by factors of between 5 and 10. The environmental assessments that identified this as unsustainable were produced, classified, and filed in government archives where they accumulated, while the aquifer depletion they documented continued at the rate that political imperatives required. The result is that Iran's aquifer system, the underground water reserves that in a well-managed arid country serve as the critical buffer against drought years, the reserve that smooths the variability of rainfall into a reliable baseline supply, has been reduced from a buffer to a deficit, not drawn down to lower levels that still contain usable water. Drawn down to the point where in specific regions, the aquifer has effectively ceased to exist as a functioning water source. The ground above those depleted aquifers is subsiding, literally sinking inward as the water that was holding it up from below is no longer there. Tehran is subsiding at up to 25 centimeters per year in specific districts. Isfahan's ancient underground qanat systems, the engineering marvel that sustained the city for thousands of years, are collapsing as the water table they were designed to access no longer exists at the depths they were built to reach. The third institutional failure was the information suppression. Iranian water scientists and environmental researchers who identified the trajectory of this crisis early, who produced the assessments and published the findings and attempted to communicate through official channels the urgency of what was happening to Iran's water systems, were not listened to. They were systematically marginalized. Their access to research funding was cut. Their institutional positions were made precarious. Some were imprisoned under the broad security legislation that the Islamic Republic applies to anyone whose work produces findings inconvenient to the regime's narrative of competent, divinely guided governance. The knowledge required to prevent the crisis was produced by Iranian scientists. It was suppressed by the Iranian government, and the crisis it described, unaddressed, became the catastrophe it predicted. Now let us translate the 97% figure and the 3 institutional failures into the daily physical reality of the 40 million Iranians living inside the crisis zone. Because statistics about surface water depletion exist at a level of abstraction that allows people to nod along and not feel what they describe. What they describe, in the specific physical daily experience of human beings, is this. In Khuzestan province, the oil-rich southwestern province that has historically been Iran's agricultural breadbasket and the source of a significant fraction of the country's food supply, the Karun River, the only navigable river in Iran, the waterway that fed the ancient civilization of Susa, that sustained agricultural systems across the most productive plains in the country for thousands of years, has been reduced to a fraction of its historical flow. Farmers whose families have worked the same land for generations are watching the irrigation channels that their grandparents maintained run dry in spring, when they are supposed to be carrying the snowmelt that feeds the summer crops. The agricultural collapse in Khuzestan is not a drought event, a temporary reduction in rainfall that will reverse when normal precipitation returns. It is a structural collapse driven by upstream dam construction, agricultural extraction, and aquifer depletion that has permanently altered the hydrology of the region in ways that no single season of above-average rainfall can reverse. The cities of Khuzestan, Avaz, Khorramshahr, Abadan are experiencing water rationing schedules that have expanded from periodic summer restrictions to year-round daily cutoffs. In Avas, a city of 1.3 million people, water supply to residential areas is interrupted for between 12 and 18 hours per day during summer months and between 6 and 10 hours per day during winter months that were historically periods of adequate supply. This is not a developing world infrastructure problem in a city that never had reliable water supply. This is the systematic, documented degradation of water infrastructure that was functioning adequately as recently as 15 years ago, in a city whose proximity to the Karun River should theoretically provide more than adequate water access, produced by the combination of river depletion, infrastructure neglect, and the financial collapse that has made repair and maintenance impossible in the current economic environment. In Isfahan, the city that was once called half the world for the magnificence of its architecture, its gardens, its bridges over the Zayanderud, the river that gives the city its historical name and its cultural identity is absent. The bridges that Safavid emperors built to span a river whose flow was considered one of the wonders of the Persian world now span a dry riverbed. The gardens that Persian poets wrote about for centuries are maintained on water trucked in from increasingly distant sources at costs that the city's budget can no longer sustain. The famous Chahar Bagh Avenue, designed around the flow of water channels that connected it to the river, exists as a monument to a hydrological system that no longer functions. In Yaz province, in the Central Plateau, the heart of Iran's ancient qanat civilization, the region where Persian engineers developed the underground irrigation technology that made settlement of arid land possible, the qanats themselves are failing, not because the engineering is inadequate. The engineering is thousands of years old and has survived everything that natural variation could deliver. They are failing because the water table they were built to access has been drawn down below the depth of the qanat shafts. You cannot draw water through a system engineered to reach 50 meters below ground when the water table is now 80 meters below ground. The technological achievement of ancient Persian civilization is being made obsolete, not by modernity, but by the specific, preventable, documented failure of the Islamic Republic to manage the resource that the ancient Persians engineered so brilliantly to capture. In Lake Urmia, the Great Salt Lake of northwestern Iran, the second largest salt lake in the world at its historical maximum, an ecosystem that supported flamingos and brine shrimp and the specific biodiversity of a hypersaline environment that took millions of years to develop. The water level has dropped by more than 6 meters since the 1990s. The lake that was visible from satellite imagery as a distinctive blue feature of the northwestern Iranian landscape now appears, in satellite imagery from 2026, as a white salt flat surrounded by a desiccation shoreline that expands every year. The fishing communities whose livelihoods depended on it are gone. The agricultural communities that use the lake's catchment basin are facing salinization of their soils, as the evaporating lake leaves behind the salt concentrations that build up in a closed basin with no outlet. The ecosystem that was there cannot be restored in any human time frame. This is what 97% surface water depletion looks like at ground level, not in the abstract language of hydrology reports, in the specific, physical daily experience of 40 million people living in the crisis zone, in rivers that were supposed to be flowing and are not, in qanats that were supposed to be delivering water and cannot reach it, in lakes that were supposed to be there and are salt flats, in water rationing schedules that have become the defining rhythm of daily life in cities that built their entire physical and social infrastructure around the assumption of reliable water supply. Now let us address the dimension of this crisis that most analysis of Iran's water situation fails to adequately connect. The water crisis does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a set of simultaneous crises that compound each other in ways that make each individual crisis worse, and that collectively create a situation whose total effect is far greater than the sum of its parts. The financial collapse, the military fracturing, the political paralysis, the social contract destruction, and the water crisis are not 5 separate problems that the Islamic Republic is managing simultaneously. They are 5 expressions of a single underlying reality, a governing system that has spent 46 years extracting value from every resource available to it: oil revenue, institutional credibility, international relationships, and now physical water, without maintaining or replenishing any of them, and that is now confronting the simultaneous arrival of the bills for 46 years of extraction without investment. The financial dimension of the water crisis is where the compounding is most immediate and most devastating. Solving Iran's water crisis, or more precisely, managing it to prevent it from becoming a full civilizational collapse rather than merely an existential emergency, requires approximately $40 to $60 billion of immediate infrastructure investment, followed by a sustained annual investment of $8 to $12 billion for at minimum 20 years. New water treatment facilities, pipe replacement across urban distribution networks that currently lose 30 to 35% of supply to leakage before it reaches any household, desalination capacity for coastal cities that have coastal access, and could theoretically supplement their supply if the capital investment were available. Agricultural water efficiency programs that would reduce the 92% agricultural consumption share while maintaining food production through precision irrigation and crop substitution. Aquifer recharge programs in the regions where the water table has declined enough to remain accessible if extraction rates are immediately reduced and recharge is actively supported. Iran does not have $40 to $60 billion. Iran does not have $4 to $6 billion. Iran's treasury is hemorrhaging $500 million a day from the blockade's impact on oil revenues and has 94% of its discretionary spending capacity gone. The government that distributed $7 food coupons to prevent starvation last month does not have the financial resources to replace a single major water treatment facility, let alone the $40 to $60 billion investment package that would be required to begin addressing the structural water deficit. The infrastructure dimension compounds the financial one. Iran's urban water distribution networks, the pipes, the pumping stations, the treatment facilities, the storage reservoirs, the pressure management systems that together constitute the physical infrastructure through which water is delivered from sources to households, are operating in conditions of advanced deterioration that the financial collapse has made it impossible to address. The pipe networks in Tehran, in Mashhad, in Isfahan, in Avaz, were designed and installed across several decades of the 20th century. They have not been systematically maintained or replaced. They are losing between 30 and 35% of the water that enters them to leakage before that water reaches any household. In a city facing existential water shortage, 1/3 of the water supply is returning to the ground through broken infrastructure that the government cannot afford to fix. The public health dimension is where the water crisis stops being an infrastructure and economic story and becomes a story about human bodies and what happens to them when the minimum physical conditions of health cannot be maintained. Waterborne disease transmission requires water contamination, and water contamination in Iran's current context is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented, spreading, accelerating public health emergency. As water pressure drops in distribution networks, the pressure differential that prevents groundwater contamination from entering pipes through the cracks and joints that deteriorated infrastructure accumulates reverses. Low-pressure distribution systems draw contaminated groundwater in, rather than pushing clean water out. Cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and a range of other waterborne pathogens that modern water treatment systems eliminated from the disease burden of Iranian cities in the 20th century are returning to the clinical case reports of Iranian physicians in the 21st. Iranian medical professionals, communicating through the diaspora channels that have become the primary pipeline for information that cannot be published in official Iranian medical literature, are documenting case increases in waterborne disease presentations that began in 2024 and have accelerated in 2025 and 2026 as water rationing expanded and distribution system pressure declined. The specific diseases being reported are not the diseases of war or famine in the conventional sense. They are the diseases of infrastructure failure. The diseases that tell you not that people are starving or being shot, but that the physical systems that were supposed to keep them healthy have stopped functioning. Pediatric malnutrition is worsening in provinces whose agricultural systems have collapsed due to water scarcity. And the relationship between water scarcity, agricultural failure, food price inflation, and child nutritional status forms a causal chain so direct that Iranian pediatric researchers have documented it with clinical specificity, even under the conditions of information suppression that the regime continues to attempt. When the water for irrigation is not available, the crops fail. When the crops fail, regional food prices rise. When regional food prices rise, on top of the 140 to 180% food inflation and already driven by the blockade and currency collapse, the families at the margin, the families who were feeding their children adequately before the compounding, cannot maintain adequate nutrition. The children show up in the clinical record with stunting and wasting and micronutrient deficiencies that Iranian pediatricians are documenting and that are reaching the diaspora networks and the international medical literature despite every effort to suppress them. Now let us address the political dimension, and this is where the water crisis connects most directly to everything else that is happening in Iran, to the protests forming in 6 provincial capitals, to the IRGC soldiers refusing orders, to the parliamentary admission that the war is lost, to the supreme leader's worst decision and its immediate consequences. Because water is not simply an infrastructure crisis in the political context of Iran in 2026. It is the specific, physical, undeniable daily experience through which 40 million people encounter the failure of the Islamic Republic's governance in a form that cannot be attributed to foreign aggression, cannot be explained by sanctions pressure, cannot be deflected by the nationalist narrative that the regime has used to manage every previous crisis. Sanctions do not drain aquifers. The U.S. naval blockade does not reduce rainfall. Foreign interference does not cause the Zayande Road to stop flowing. The dam construction decisions that trapped the river's flow upstream were made by Iranian officials. The agricultural subsidies that emptied the aquifers were authorized by the Islamic Republic's government. The infrastructure maintenance budgets that should have fixed the pipes were diverted by the IRGC's construction empire. The environmental scientists who identified the trajectory were silenced by the regime's security services. The water crisis is the specific crisis that strips the regime of its most reliable defensive narrative because its causes are fully, documentably, undeniably internal, the product of 46 years of decisions made by the people, asking the Iranian population to endure the consequences of those decisions without accountability. The Khuzestan water protests of 2021 were the first major indication of what water crisis means as a political force. They were smaller than the December 2025 uprising. They were more geographically contained. They were suppressed more quickly and with less of the comprehensive brutality that January 2026 would demonstrate the regime was capable of. But they revealed something that has become central to understanding the current protest composition. Water crisis produces a specific, intense, locally rooted fury that differs in character from the economic and political grievances that drive general protest waves. It produces the fury of people whose most basic physical need, the need that precedes every other need, that cannot be deferred or substituted or managed by any psychological or social coping mechanism, is being unmet by the institution responsible for meeting it. It produces the fury of parents who cannot give their children water. And that specific fury does not negotiate, does not accept half measures, does not respond to the combination of limited concession and continued repression that has historically allowed the regime to manage protest waves without fundamental change. The water crisis of 2026 is not the Khuzestan water protests of 2021. It is those protests multiplied across 40 million people in every region of the country where the surface water depletion and aquifer exhaustion and infrastructure failure have converged into the daily experience of turning on a tap and getting nothing, or getting brown water, or getting water for 4 hours and then nothing for 20. In the middle of the hottest summer that regional climate monitoring has recorded in the Iranian plateau in the instrumental record. The hottest summer. This detail matters enormously and is not receiving the analytical attention it deserves. The summer of 2026 has brought temperatures to the Iranian plateau that have broken historical records in multiple provinces simultaneously. Avaz recorded temperatures above 53 degrees Celsius, 127 degrees Fahrenheit, during the July heat event. Isfahan recorded temperatures 8 degrees above the historical average for June across a sustained 12-day period. Tehran recorded 3 consecutive nights above 35 degrees Celsius. A heat event that, in a city with unreliable water supply and frequent power outages, creates the specific, dangerous condition of urban heat stress that public health researchers identify as producing excess mortality in elderly, pediatric, and medically vulnerable populations. Heat stress at these temperatures requires water. Not the water for cooking and hygiene and basic sanitation that is already unavailable for 20 hours a day in some districts. The additional water for the basic temperature regulation that human physiology requires to survive in 53-degree heat. When that water is not available, when the tap runs dry during the hottest part of the day in a region experiencing record temperatures, the public health emergency that the water crisis was already creating becomes an acute mortality event. Iranian emergency services have documented heat-related fatalities during the current summer heat events that are consistent with the conditions of insufficient water access in high-temperature environments. The numbers being communicated through diaspora medical networks suggest that the documented fatalities represent a significant undercounting of actual excess mortality because the healthcare system's capacity to track and report is itself compromised by the same infrastructure failures affecting every other system. 40 million people in a water crisis in the hottest summer on record, in a country with 97% of its surface water sources critically depleted, in an economy with 94% of its discretionary spending capacity gone, with a government that cannot fix the pipes because it distributed its last money in $7 food coupons, with a security apparatus whose soldiers have not been paid in 4 months, with a parliament that has acknowledged the war is lost, with a supreme leader who cannot be reached and an elected president who cannot govern, with protests forming in 6 provincial capitals simultaneously, with IRGC soldiers refusing orders, with Russian and Chinese support having evaporated, with the Hormuz denial strategy having failed and its assets having been neutralized by an immediate American response. This is the full picture. Not each crisis in isolation, but all of them simultaneously, each one compounding the others, each one making the others worse and harder to address, and more likely to produce the specific cascading failure that structural engineers call progressive collapse, and that historians call simply the end. The water crisis is not the most dramatic component of Iran's total collapse. The military defeats are more dramatic. The parliamentary admissions are more historically significant. The IRGC's bankruptcy and the soldiers refusing orders are more immediately consequential for the regime's survival. But the water crisis is the most irreversible component. Military defeats can theoretically be reversed. Financial collapse can theoretically be addressed with sufficient external support. Political paralysis can theoretically be broken by a sufficiently courageous internal actor. The aquifer depletion cannot be reversed in any human time frame. The Zayande route will not flow again based on any intervention available to any government that will exist in Iran in the next 50 years, without rainfall patterns that are not coming. The salt flat that was Lake Urmia will not refill. The subsiding ground under Tehran will not re-elevate. The qanats will not reach water that is not there to reach. The point of no return in Iran's water crisis was crossed before the financial collapse began, before the blockade was imposed, before the IRGC's salaries went unpaid. It was crossed by the accumulated weight of 46 years of decisions that extracted from the water system without investing in it, that pumped from the aquifers without recharging them, that dammed the rivers without maintaining their ecological function, that suppressed the scientists who understood what was happening before the consequences became irreversible. It was crossed before most of the world knew it was happening. And the 40 million people living inside the crisis zone do not have the luxury of the retrospective clarity that lets everyone else understand what it means now that it has been crossed. They understand it every morning when they turn on the tap, when they walk to the water distribution point with containers, when they tell their children to wait for the water to come back, when they watch the number on the thermometer climb past 50 degrees and the pipe stays dry, when they calculate with the specific, quiet, devastating clarity of people who have run out of alternatives to calculation, that the institution responsible for providing the most basic physical requirement of their survival has failed them, not temporarily, not in ways that the next government policy or the next international negotiation or the next season of rainfall will fix, permanently, in ways that will outlast every political arrangement that currently exists in Iran, in ways that will define the physical possibilities of Iranian life for generations, regardless of who governs. That calculation, running in 40 million minds simultaneously, is not a political position. It is a physical reality arriving at a political conclusion. And physical realities arriving at political conclusions do not produce political debates. They produce history. If what you just heard gave you something you could not find in the mainstream coverage of Iran's water crisis, not the brief mention in a broader Iran story, not the one-paragraph acknowledgement in a sanctions analysis, but the full weight of what 97% surface water depletion, 40 million affected people, record summer temperatures, and a government that cannot fix a pipe mean when they arrive simultaneously, then share this with one person who is trying to understand what is actually happening to the 40 million people living inside it, not because it will change what is coming. The point of no return was crossed before most of the world was paying attention. What is coming does not need our permission or our awareness to arrive. But because 40 million people are living inside a water crisis, that is the most permanent dimension of Iran's total collapse. And the minimum the rest of the world can do is understand what they are living through with the seriousness it deserves. Drop your answer in the comments to the question that the water crisis makes the most urgent question in the entire Iran collapse analysis. Every other dimension of the collapse is theoretically reversible with sufficient resources, sufficient political will, sufficient institutional change. The water crisis is not. So when a regime collapses and is replaced by whatever comes next, when the protests succeed or the managed transition happens or the unmanaged collapse produces some new political arrangement, what does the new government do on day one about 40 million people in a water crisis that the point of no return has already been crossed for? That question does not have an easy answer. The comments on this channel have been ahead of the mainstream analysis on every major Iran development. Be ahead of it on this one. Tell us what you think comes next for the water, for the 40 million, for the country that is simultaneously losing everything else and discovering that the most fundamental thing was already lost before the rest of it started falling. Subscribe, because the water crisis is not going to resolve before the political crisis reaches its conclusion. They are going to arrive at their respective endpoints simultaneously in the same country, affecting the same 85 million people, producing consequences that no analyst has fully modeled because the full combination has not existed before in the modern history of any state that the international community has been watching in real time. You are watching it in real time now. The tap is dry, the aquifer is gone, the point of no return is behind them. And 40 million people are doing the only calculation left to do.